6 months pregnant, widowed, and left with an 8-year-old son, and just $500, Charlotte was thrown out of the only home she had ever known. With nowhere else to go, she spent almost every dollar she had on an abandoned stone house everyone warned would become her grave before winter. But beneath its freezing floor, she discovered a secret hidden for more than a century. This pregnant widow's survival story would soon save lives, and what happened when the worst blizzard arrived will stay with you long after this inspiring story ends. The final click of the lock behind Charlotte Bennett sounded like the end of a life. Not a door closing, a life. She stood frozen on the weathered porch of the old farmhouse outside Cedar Hollow, Montana, staring at the brass doorknob she had touched thousands of times before. For 11 years, that door had meant home. Behind it was the kitchen where Nathan used to kiss her forehead while she made coffee before sunrise. The narrow hallway still carried the pencil marks where they had measured Caleb's height every birthday. Upstairs was the bedroom where Charlotte had whispered to her husband that they were going to have another baby. Nathan had cried that night. He had placed both hands over her still flat stomach and laughed through his tears. Then, only weeks later, the doctors told them the cancer had spread. 4 months ago, Charlotte buried him. Now she was being told to bury the rest of her life, too. "Mom!" Caleb's voice pulled her back. Her 8-year-old son stood beside her, clutching the sleeve of her worn wool coat with both hands. He was trying so hard not to cry that his lower lip had begun to tremble. Charlotte rested one hand on his shoulder. The other moved instinctively to her stomach. 6 months pregnant. A little girl. Nathan's daughter. Sometimes, late at night, when the baby kicked, Charlotte would place her palm against the movement and wonder if somehow her daughter could feel how desperately she was loved. Nathan would never hold her, never hear her first cry, never watch her take her first step. And now Charlotte didn't even know where she would bring his daughter home after she was born. "Where are we going, Mom?" Caleb whispered. Charlotte looked down at him. There are moments when a mother wants to lie because the truth is simply too cruel for a child. She wanted to tell him they had somewhere to go. She wanted to promise him a warm bed that night. She wanted to say, "Don't worry, Mom has a plan." But she had no plan. At her feet sat one battered suitcase and 2 canvas bags. That was all Ryan had allowed her to take. 11 years of marriage. 11 years of photographs, Christmas mornings, scraped knees, bedtime stories, arguments, forgiveness, laughter, and love, reduced to whatever she could carry in 1 hour. Behind her stood Nathan's older brother, Ryan. According to an old will Nathan had never gotten around to changing, the farm now belonged to him. Ryan had wasted no time reminding her of that. He stepped onto the porch and held out a thin white envelope. "Here." Charlotte took it. Inside were $500. She stared at the bills, then slowly raised her eyes. "500? It's more than I have to give you." His voice held no warmth. "No shame." "Nothing." Ryan glanced at Caleb before his eyes dropped toward Charlotte's pregnant belly. "Take the boy and go somewhere warmer," he said. "You can't raise 2 children out here alone." For a second, Charlotte couldn't breathe. This was Nathan's brother, the man who had stood beside them at their wedding, the uncle who had once bounced Caleb on his knee, and now he was putting Nathan's pregnant widow and child out into the cold with $500. Caleb suddenly reached for her hand. Charlotte felt his small fingers close around hers. Then, beneath her other palm, the baby kicked. Once, softly, almost like a reminder. Charlotte looked at her son, then at the home she had just lost. Something inside her broke that afternoon, but something else refused to. She had no house, no husband, almost no money, and nowhere to go. But she still had 2 children depending on her. One was holding her hand. The other was growing beneath her heart. Charlotte tightened her fingers around Caleb's. Then she picked up the suitcase. She didn't know it yet, but the road she was about to walk would take her to a place everyone else had abandoned, a place that would nearly destroy her. And one day, save far more lives than her own. Charlotte did not look back when she walked away from the farmhouse. She was afraid that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to keep going. Caleb walked beside her carrying one of the canvas bags, though it was almost too heavy for his small arms. Every few steps, Charlotte noticed him turning his head toward the house. His house, his bedroom, his father's workshop. Everything familiar was disappearing behind them. Charlotte wanted to take the bag from him, but the weight of the suitcase already pulled painfully against her shoulder, and after less than half a mile, a dull ache had begun spreading across her lower back. She was 6 months pregnant. Every doctor had told her not to overexert herself, but doctors gave advice to women who had choices. Charlotte had none. By the time they reached Cedar Hollow, the afternoon sky had turned the pale gray color that warned of an early Montana cold snap. She had $500 in her coat pocket. That was everything standing between her children and homelessness. She tried the boarding house first. The woman behind the desk asked for a month's rent and a deposit. Charlotte quietly counted the bills in her envelope. She didn't have enough. At the second place, the landlord asked for references and proof of income. She had neither. At the third, she didn't even walk inside after seeing the price written on the window. Caleb never complained. That somehow hurt the most. He simply followed his mother from one place to another, carrying his bag and pretending he wasn't tired. Finally, he asked, "Are we going to sleep outside?" Charlotte stopped walking. Those 6 words nearly broke her. She knelt in front of him despite the pressure it put on her swollen belly and pulled his cold little hands between hers. "No," she whispered. Caleb searched her face. "You promised." Charlotte swallowed. A promise from a mother should mean something. So she nodded. "I promise." She had no idea how she would keep it. But she would. An hour later, Charlotte pushed open the door of the county clerk's office. Caleb sat quietly on a wooden bench while she approached the counter. "I need to see the tax foreclosure list," she said. The clerk looked at her stomach, then at the child waiting behind her. "What kind of property, boy? The cheapest one you have?" He hesitated before sliding a folder across the counter. Charlotte ran her finger slowly down the page. $2,800, $4,900, $1, $200. Every number might as well have been a million. Then her finger stopped. Lot 63, 5 acres, 450. Her heart jumped. "There," she said. "What about that one?" The clerk's expression changed immediately. "Ma'am." "What?" He leaned forward. "That's up on Raven's Crest." Charlotte waited. "People around here call it Widow's Ridge." A cold silence settled between them. The clerk explained that an abandoned stone cottage stood on the property. No electricity, no plumbing, no maintained road. The soil was mostly granite. The wind was relentless. And nobody had lived there in nearly 50 years. "It's not really a home anymore," he said gently. Charlotte looked down at the price again. $450. If she bought it, she would have $50 left. $50 to feed Caleb. $50 to prepare for a baby who would arrive in 3 months. $50 between them and nothing. But the deed would be hers. No landlord could throw them out. No relative could lock the door behind them. Charlotte looked toward the bench. Caleb had fallen asleep, sitting upright, his cheek resting against the canvas bag containing what remained of his childhood. Something inside her tightened. "I'll take it." The clerk stared at her. "Mrs. Bennett, I don't think you understand. That cottage may not even be safe." Charlotte's hand moved over her belly. The baby shifted beneath her palm. Then she looked him directly in the eyes. "It is all I can afford." The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. When the deed was placed in her hands, Charlotte didn't feel like a landowner. She felt terrified. The walk to Raven's Crest took nearly 2 hours. The road became gravel, then dirt, then little more than a narrow trail climbing into the mountains. The wind grew stronger with every step. Charlotte stopped several times, pretending she needed to adjust the suitcase so Caleb wouldn't realize she was struggling to catch her breath. Then they reached the ridge, and saw it. Charlotte's heart sank. The cottage looked less like a house than something the mountain had tried to swallow and failed. Gray stone walls leaned beneath a broken roof. Several slate tiles were missing entirely. Dark gaps scarred the mortar. One window had been boarded over, while the other stared back at them like an empty eye. Around it stretched 5 acres of rock, stubborn grass, and twisted pine trees bent permanently by the wind. Caleb stood completely still. "This is our house." Charlotte couldn't answer. His brave expression disappeared. Tears filled his eyes. "I want Dad." That was all it took. Charlotte dropped the suitcase. She sank to her knees in the cold dirt and pulled her son against her. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I want him too." Caleb began sobbing against her chest. Charlotte held him with one arm and covered her belly with the other as tears finally spilled down her face. For the first time since Nathan died, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She was scared, terrified. She didn't know how to repair a roof. She didn't know how to survive a Montana winter in a stone ruin. She didn't know how she was going to give birth to a child while trying to keep another one fed. And for one terrible moment, kneeling in the dirt with the wind tearing at her coat, Charlotte wondered if Ryan had been right. Maybe she couldn't do this. Then the baby moved. A small kick beneath her palm. Charlotte closed her eyes. Caleb was crying in her arms. Her unborn daughter was moving beneath her heart. 2 small lives, both trusting her to keep going. So Charlotte wiped her tears. She stood, and she picked up the suitcase. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. Caleb looked up at her. "Where?" Charlotte turned toward the broken stone cottage. Her voice trembled, but the words did not. "Home?" Neither of them knew that beneath those cold stone floors, hidden in darkness for almost a century, something was waiting. Something that would turn this abandoned ruin into their salvation. The first night in the cottage taught Charlotte something she had been too frightened to admit. Owning a house did not mean you had a home. For the next 7 days, survival became their entire world. Charlotte spent 48 of her remaining $50 on flour, dried beans, salt, candles, matches, and a heavy canvas tarp from the general store. After that, she stopped counting money. There was almost nothing left to count. She stretched the tarp across the worst section of the roof herself, climbing an old wooden ladder while Caleb stood below with both hands wrapped around it. "Please be careful. Mom." "I am, sweetheart." But she wasn't. The wind pulled at her coat like invisible hands, and twice she nearly lost her footing. At 6 months pregnant, every movement felt heavier than it once had. Her back ached constantly. Her ankles were swollen by evening. Her fingers cracked and bled from forcing mud and grass into the gaps between the stones. But whenever she felt like stopping, she would look at Caleb, and then she would touch her belly. So she kept working. Water came from a rust-colored spring nearly half a mile downhill. Firewood came from whatever dead branches they could gather. At night, mother and son slept beside the hearth beneath every blanket they owned. Sometimes Caleb would wake and whisper, "Mom, are you awake?" Charlotte always answered the same way. "I'm right here." Even when she hadn't slept at all. Even when she was lying in darkness, listening to the wind scream around the cottage and wondering how she could possibly bring a newborn baby into this place. One night, Caleb fell asleep with his hand resting on her belly. "The baby kicked beneath his palm." His eyes opened wide. "She kicked me." For the first time in days, Charlotte laughed. Just once. Softly. Caleb smiled. Do you think she knows me? Charlotte brushed the hair from his forehead. I think she already loves you. His smile faded. Do you think Dad knows her? Charlotte felt something tear quietly inside her. She looked toward the dying fire. I hope so. Then she pulled Caleb closer and waited until he fell asleep before allowing herself to cry. The storm came a week after they arrived. Not snow. Not yet. Just a vicious mountain gale that struck Raven's Crest after sunset. The cottage groaned beneath it. Wind forced itself through every weakness Charlotte had failed to seal. Then a violent gust plunged down the chimney. Smoke exploded into the room. Caleb started coughing. Charlotte struggled upright, one hand supporting her belly. Open the door! Caleb obeyed while Charlotte dropped to her knees beside the hearth. The fire had nearly died. She began clearing ash with the iron poker, desperate to restore enough airflow to relight it. Then she felt something move beneath her hand. Charlotte froze. One of the massive flagstones forming the base of the hearth had shifted. At first she thought she imagined it. She pressed again. The stone moved. Caleb. He came closer. What? Bring me the candle. Together, they pushed. The stone scraped sideways with a deep grinding sound. Underneath was not dirt. There was another slab. Darker, smoother, and set into its center was a thick iron ring. Caleb stared at it. What is that? Charlotte's heart began pounding. I don't know. She wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled. Nothing. She tried again. Pain shot across her lower back. Mom, stop. Charlotte released it immediately and breathed through the pain, one hand moving protectively to her stomach. For several frightening seconds, she waited. Then she felt it. A tiny movement. The baby. Charlotte closed her eyes in relief. I'm okay. This time Caleb took hold of the ring beside her. Together. Charlotte looked at her son. Together. They pulled. Slowly, the iron slab lifted. A breath of air rose from beneath the floor. Charlotte expected the smell of mold or stagnant water. Instead, the air was cool. Clean! And strangely dry. Stone steps disappeared into darkness. Every instinct told her not to go down. But curiosity had awakened inside her, a feeling she thought grief had killed. Charlotte lit a candle. You stay here? No. Caleb, I'm not letting you go alone. His words stopped her. For a moment, she heard Nathan in him. Charlotte swallowed hard. Stay on the steps, right behind me. They descended carefully. At the bottom was a small circular chamber built from perfectly fitted stone. And there, in the center, stood an oak table. On it lay a large leather-bound book. Open! Waiting. Beside it sat a sealed wooden crate covered in dust. Charlotte approached the table. The candle trembled in her hand as she read the words written across the first page in faded ink. The final testament of my work, Elias Whitmore, Mason and Engineer, 1891. Charlotte turned the page. Then another. Her breath caught. There were drawings everywhere. Channels beneath floors. Stone vents. Underground passages. Airflow diagrams. Measurements. Calculations. And drawings of the cottage. Her cottage. Caleb leaned closer. Mom, what is all this? Charlotte didn't answer, because she was beginning to understand. This ruined house had not been built like an ordinary house. Elias Whitmore had designed the walls, floor, chimney, and underground channels to work together. The earth beneath the cottage maintained a relatively stable temperature. His system drew outside air underground, allowed the surrounding earth and stone to temper it, then guided that air beneath the massive flagstone floor before releasing it through carefully positioned vents. The hearth itself served another purpose. Its enormous stone mass could absorb heat from a fire and release it slowly long after the flames were gone. It was simple, brilliant, and almost entirely forgotten. Charlotte looked around the chamber. For the first time, she noticed something impossible. Upstairs, the wind was screaming. Down here, the candle flame barely moved, and the air was warmer, only slightly, but unmistakably warmer. Charlotte placed a trembling hand against the stone wall. Then she felt another kick beneath her ribs. She looked down at her belly. For weeks, every door in her life had been closing. Nathan was gone. Her home was gone. Her money was gone. Her future had seemed to disappear with them. Yet somehow, beneath the floor of the cheapest abandoned house in the county, she had found a door no one knew existed. Charlotte lowered herself into the old wooden chair and continued reading. Page after page, instruction after instruction. How to clear the buried intake. How to repair the underground channels. How to seal the stone joints. How to make the house breathe again. Tears slowly filled her eyes. Not tears of grief this time. Something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Caleb rested his head against her shoulder. Can we fix it? Charlotte looked at the diagrams, then at her bruised hands, then down at the child growing inside her. She had no training, almost no money, and winter was coming. But for the first time since Nathan died, Charlotte could see something ahead of her besides loss. She closed her hand around Caleb's. I don't know, she whispered. Then she looked at the old journal again. But we're going to try. Above them, the wind continued to howl. But deep beneath the cottage, Charlotte Bennett sat beside her son and listened to something stronger. The faint heartbeat of a house that had been sleeping for more than a century. And somehow, it felt as though it had been waiting for them. Charlotte barely slept that night. Long after Caleb had curled beneath the blankets beside her, she remained near the hearth with Elias Whitmore's journal open across her knees. She read until the candle burned almost to nothing. Then she read the same pages again. For the first time since Nathan's death, her mind was occupied by something other than grief. There was work to do. At sunrise, Charlotte woke Caleb and spread the old diagrams across the floor. We're going to make this house breathe again. Caleb looked at her as if she had just told him they were going to rebuild the mountain. Then he smiled. Tell me what to do. Those 5 words nearly brought her to tears. They began with the northern air intake. According to Elias's drawings, it should have been buried somewhere behind the cottage. Mother and son searched until Caleb noticed several unusually arranged stones beneath a tangle of roots. They dug and dug. Hours passed. The earth was hard, packed with rocks and decades of debris. Charlotte's back burned. Her fingers opened along the old cracks until thin lines of blood mixed with the dirt. More than once, Caleb caught her stopping with one hand pressed against her lower back and the other beneath her belly. Mom, you need to rest. Charlotte wanted to say no. Instead, she sat beside him. Because she was beginning to understand that surviving did not mean pretending she wasn't tired. Sometimes strength meant knowing when to sit down. Caleb handed her their water bottle. Then he crouched beside her belly. She's helping too, he said. Charlotte smiled faintly. How? She's giving you someone else to be brave for. Charlotte turned her face away before he could see her tears. By afternoon, they uncovered the stone arch. The intake was real. So was everything else Elias had written. Something changed inside Charlotte at that moment. Until then, she had thought of the cottage as the last place left for people who had nowhere else to go. Now she began seeing it differently. The strange openings in the walls had purpose. The enormous flagstones had purpose. Even the unusually thick stone walls had purpose. This wasn't a ruin. It was a machine that had fallen asleep. And perhaps she had not been sent here simply to disappear. Perhaps she had been given something to awaken. Over the following days, Charlotte followed Elias's instructions carefully. The journal called for a sealing mixture made from river clay, powdered granite, and natural fibers. There was no money for materials, so they improvised. They collected clay near the spring. Caleb spent hours crushing small pieces of granite with a hammer until they became coarse gray powder. Charlotte mixed everything by hand. Then came the underground channels. Some were so narrow she could barely crawl through them. Being 6 months pregnant made the work frighteningly difficult. She moved slowly, inch by inch, carrying a lantern ahead of her. Dust coated her face. Her knees bruised against stone. Sometimes she had to stop simply to breathe. But each damaged joint she repaired felt like one small answer to everything life had taken from her. Nathan was still gone. She could not repair that. She could not undo Ryan's betrayal. She could not give Caleb his old bedroom back. But this broken stone beneath her hands, she could fix this. And that realization was changing her. Then, one afternoon, Charlotte heard an engine. A polished pickup had stopped where the trail became too rough to continue. Ryan stepped out. He walked toward the cottage in expensive boots, staring at the trenches, buckets of clay, piles of stone, and Caleb crushing granite near the wall. Then he saw Charlotte. Her clothes were dirty. Her hands were bleeding. Her hair clung to her face. One hand rested protectively beneath her pregnant belly. Ryan laughed. Not loudly. That somehow made it worse. "So this is what you're doing?" Charlotte said nothing. "I heard people in town talking about you," he continued. "A pregnant widow digging holes in a mountain because some dead man left instructions in a book." He looked at the cottage. "Charlotte, this isn't determination. It's insanity." Every word found exactly where she was weakest. Winter is coming. What happens when that baby comes early? What happens when Caleb gets sick? Charlotte's hand stopped moving. Ryan stepped closer. "You think Nathan would want this?" That hurt. More than everything else. For one terrible second, Charlotte looked at Caleb. His small hands were covered in granite dust. Then she looked down at her stomach. What if Ryan was right? What if this wasn't courage? What if it was pride? What if she was risking her children's lives because she was too ashamed to admit she had failed? Ryan shook his head. "When this falls apart, don't come asking me to save you." Then he walked away. That night, Charlotte sat beside the dying fire and cried as quietly as she could. She considered leaving. She truly did. Then her eyes fell upon Elias's journal. A drawing on one page showed a small pine growing from a crack in solid rock. Beneath it, Elias had written, "The strongest life does not always grow where the ground is kind. Sometimes it grows where no one believed life could exist at all." Charlotte stared at those words for a long time. Then she looked at Caleb sleeping beside her. His hand was resting over her belly again, as if even in sleep he was protecting his sister. Charlotte finally understood. Ryan believed strength meant having enough money to never become desperate, enough property to never become homeless, enough power to never need anyone. But maybe strength was something else. Maybe strength was waking up afraid and working anyway. Maybe courage wasn't knowing everything would be all right. Maybe courage was having no such guarantee and choosing to continue. Charlotte wiped her tears. She placed her hand over Caleb's. Beneath both their hands, the baby moved. A gentle kick. Charlotte smiled through her tears. "All right," she whispered. "Tomorrow, we keep going." Outside, the wind swept mercilessly across Raven's Crest. But inside that broken stone cottage, something had changed. Not the house. Not yet. Charlotte. She was no longer waiting for someone to rescue her. She was beginning to understand that the woman who might save her family was already there. The next morning, Charlotte kept her promise. She got up, and she kept going. For 3 more weeks, Raven's Crest became their entire world. Day after day, Charlotte and Caleb followed Elias Whitmore's journal as if the faded pages were a map leading them out of darkness. They cleared every buried channel they could reach. They repacked every crumbling joint with clay and powdered granite. They cleaned the narrow vents until air could pass freely through them again. The work was slow, painfully slow, and Charlotte's pregnancy was becoming impossible to ignore. Her belly seemed heavier every morning. Some days, simply bending down to lace her boots left her breathless. At night, cramps tightened through her back and legs until she had to bite her lip to keep from waking Caleb. But morning always came, and Charlotte always stood up again. Not because she felt strong. Most mornings, she didn't. She stood because Caleb was watching. Because a little girl was growing beneath her heart. And because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about proving Ryan wrong. It became about proving to her children that being abandoned did not mean being defeated. At last, only one task remained. The iron door beneath the hearth had to be sealed. According to Elias's journal, the underground chamber was the heart of the entire system. If the trapdoor leaked air, the pressure would fail and the house would never breathe as it had been designed to. Charlotte cleaned the iron rim carefully. Caleb knelt beside her with a rag. Together, they applied the last of the old ceiling grease they had found inside Elias's wooden crate. Then Charlotte placed both hands on the heavy door. Caleb added his, "Ready?" she asked. He nodded. "Ready." They lowered it together. The iron door settled into place with a deep, soft thud. Charlotte remained kneeling beside it. Neither of them spoke. For 3 weeks, they had worked toward this moment. 3 weeks of bleeding hands. 3 weeks of cold nights. 3 weeks of wondering whether they were restoring a forgotten masterpiece, or simply chasing the dream of a dead man. Caleb finally whispered, "What happens now?" Charlotte looked at the sealed door. "We wait." And waiting was almost harder than working. Nothing happened. No rush of warm air. No mysterious sound beneath the floor. No miracle. Charlotte prepared their small evening fire and tried not to let Caleb see the disappointment on her face. Maybe Ryan had been right. Maybe age had destroyed the system beyond repair. Maybe she had misunderstood the journal. Maybe hope had simply made her see what she desperately wanted to see. Then, sometime after sunset, Charlotte noticed something. She was standing near the table when she realized she wasn't rubbing her hands together. She stopped. The fire had burned low almost an hour earlier. Normally, by now, cold would already be creeping through the floor and climbing into her bones. But it wasn't. Charlotte slowly removed one boot. Then her sock. Caleb stared at her. "Mom." She placed her bare foot against the flagstone. Her breath caught. The floor wasn't warm. Not exactly. But it wasn't freezing. For weeks, those stones had felt like blocks of winter beneath their feet. Now they felt neutral. Charlotte dropped to her knees. She pressed her palm against the floor, then against the wall. "Caleb, bring me the candle." He hurried over. Charlotte held the flame near one of the low stone vents. The flame leaned, not violently, gently, steadily. Inward. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. The house was breathing. "It works," she whispered. Caleb looked at her. "What?" She laughed. Then she began crying at the same time. "It works." Caleb threw his arms around her neck. Charlotte held him tightly, laughing through tears she could no longer control. "We did it, Mom." "No, sweetheart." She kissed his hair. "We did it together." Over the next several days, the change became undeniable. Outside, frost covered the grass each morning. The temperature dropped toward freezing. Inside, the cottage remained steady. Charlotte placed their small thermometer on the table. The needle stopped at 52 degrees. 52? It wasn't the luxurious warmth of the farmhouse they had lost. There was no furnace, no electric heater, no roaring fire. But for Charlotte, that number felt like a miracle. Because 52 degrees meant Caleb wasn't shivering. It meant she no longer woke, terrified that the cold might harm the baby. It meant they could survive. One afternoon, Charlotte was preparing beans when she heard footsteps outside. She stiffened. For a moment, she feared Ryan had returned. Instead, an elderly man appeared at the doorway. His name was Walter Hayes. He owned a small cattle farm in the valley below Raven's Crest. Charlotte remembered him from the county office. He had been one of the few people who hadn't laughed when she bought the property. Walter carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. "Saw no smoke coming from your chimney," he said. His weathered face was serious. Cold day for no fire. Charlotte understood immediately. He thought something had happened to them. "I came to check on the boy," he added, then glanced at her belly. "And you—" Charlotte stepped aside. "Come in." Walter entered, then stopped. His expression changed. He removed his hat. Then his gloves. His eyes moved toward the hearth. "No fire!" He looked at Charlotte. "Then at the floor." The old farmer slowly knelt and placed one broad, weathered hand against the flagstone. For several seconds, he said nothing. Charlotte watched him. Walter had spent nearly 70 years reading weather in the clouds, soil, livestock, and wind. He didn't understand the engineering beneath his palm. But he understood cold, and he knew what should have been happening inside this stone cottage. Finally, he looked up. "How—" Charlotte glanced toward Elias's journal. "It's a long story." Walter looked around once more. Then his gaze settled on Charlotte. Not with pity. Not this time. With respect. He stood without another question and placed the burlap sack on the table. Inside were potatoes, carrots, a slab of cured bacon, a jar of apple butter, and, wrapped carefully in cloth, a small knitted baby blanket. Charlotte froze. Her fingers touched the soft wool. "Your wife made that—" Walter nodded. "Said a baby shouldn't come into winter without something warm waiting for her." Charlotte lowered her head. For weeks, she had forced herself not to cry in front of strangers. But she couldn't stop this time. "Thank you." Walter cleared his throat and looked toward the window, giving her the dignity of pretending not to notice. Then he said something Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life. "Folks in town think you're up here losing your mind." He paused. A faint smile appeared beneath his gray mustache. "I think you may be the only one who's been paying attention." After Walter left, Charlotte sat at the table with the little blanket in her lap. Caleb touched it carefully. "It's for her." Charlotte nodded. "For your sister." Caleb smiled. And beneath the blanket, beneath Charlotte's hands, the baby kicked. Charlotte closed her eyes. For the first time since Nathan died, someone had given her something without asking for anything in return. Not money, not charity. Something far more precious. Belief. Outside, the first flakes of snow began drifting across Raven's Crest. Charlotte watched them through the window. She didn't know that soon the temperature would fall farther than anyone in Cedar Hollow could remember. She didn't know that roads would disappear, that electricity would fail, that homes with expensive heating systems would become frozen shells. She didn't know that people who had pitied her would soon climb this mountain begging to come inside. And she certainly didn't know that one of them would be Ryan. All Charlotte knew was that her son was no longer shivering. Her unborn daughter had a warm blanket waiting for her. And the house everyone had called worthless was breathing beneath her feet. For the first time in months, Charlotte placed both hands over her belly and whispered words she had almost forgotten how to believe. "We're going to be okay. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softly at first, almost beautifully. But far to the north, something much colder was already moving toward them. And the greatest test of Charlotte's faith had only just begun. The snow that Charlotte had watched drifting past the window did not stop. By the following morning, Raven's crest had disappeared beneath 6 inches of white. By afternoon, it was nearly a foot. Then the radio warning came. Charlotte was kneading the last of the flour into bread when the old battery-powered radio crackled on the table. Encore, an Arctic system of unusual intensity. She stopped. Horntum, temperatures expected to fall well below zero, Satsu. Caleb looked up. The announcer's voice disappeared beneath static before returning. Oi, residents are strongly advised to remain indoors. Wind gusts may exceed 70 miles per hour. Heavy snowfall could make roads impassable for several days. Charlotte's hands went still. She looked towards the window. 3 months earlier, those words would have terrified her. Now she placed one hand over her belly and listened. Winter had finally come to test everything she had built. Charlotte spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. She carried water from the spring until every bucket and jar was full. She stacked their remaining firewood beside the small stove. She counted the potatoes Walter had brought. The carrots. The beans. The bacon. Not much, but enough if they were careful. Caleb watched her. Are we going to be okay? Charlotte looked at him. She remembered the first day on the ridge. The same frightened eyes. The same question hidden beneath different words. Back then, she had lied because she needed him to believe her. This time, she didn't have to. Yes, she said softly. We're going to be okay. That night, the storm arrived. It did not sound like weather. It sounded alive. The wind struck the cottage with such force that Caleb jumped from his blanket. The roof groaned. Snow slammed against the windows. Outside, the world vanished into white. Charlotte pulled Caleb close. Then she waited. For cold. For drafts. For the first sign that Elias's system had failed. An hour passed. Then 2. Nothing. The thermometer remained at 53 degrees. Charlotte stared at it. Outside, the temperature was plunging below zero. Inside, the cottage remained steady. 53. Not warm enough for comfort. Warm enough for life. The house was holding... Charlotte closed her eyes. Thank you, Elias, she whispered. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The radio died sometime during the first night after the town's power grid failed. Their only connection to Cedar Hollow disappeared into silence. Caleb and Charlotte lived by candlelight. They cooked soup on the iron stove. Charlotte read aloud while Caleb lay with his head against her shoulder. At night, he spoke to his unborn sister through Charlotte's belly. You picked a bad winter to come, he whispered once. Charlotte laughed. Then Caleb added, But don't worry, I'll take care of you. Charlotte turned her face away, because suddenly she could see Nathan sitting beside them. Not as a ghost, as a memory. His kindness living inside their son. She kissed Caleb's forehead. Your dad would be so proud of you. Caleb looked up. Would he be proud of you too? Charlotte couldn't answer immediately. For months, she had wondered whether she had failed Nathan. Failed by losing the farm. Failed by bringing their children to a ruin. Failed every time she cried after Caleb fell asleep. But now, with the storm screaming outside and her children safe inside the house, she had restored with bleeding hands. Charlotte finally allowed herself to believe something different. I hope so, she whispered. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence was almost frightening. Charlotte pushed against the front door. It barely moved. Snow had buried half the entrance. She and Caleb dug until they created an opening large enough to squeeze through. Charlotte stepped outside. Her breath caught. The world had been erased. Snowdrifts rose 10, even 15 feet in places. Trees had disappeared halfway beneath them. The road was gone. The sky was painfully blue. The cold cut through her coat within seconds. Then Caleb pointed. "Mom." Far below the ridge, something was moving. Dark shapes. "People!" Charlotte narrowed her eyes. There were 7 of them. They were climbing toward the cottage. Slowly. Desperately. Walter Hayes was in front. Behind him were several townspeople. And near the back, stumbling between 2 men, was Ryan. Charlotte stopped breathing. They reached the cottage nearly 20 minutes later. Walter's beard was crusted with ice. One woman's lips had turned blue. A little girl was crying silently because she no longer had enough strength to cry loudly. And Ryan looked nothing like the man who had stood on Charlotte's porch and told her she couldn't survive. His expensive coat was frozen stiff. His face was gray. His hands shook uncontrollably. Walter struggled to speak. "The shelter." He inhaled painfully. "Generator quit. Fuel's gone. Pipes froze." Charlotte looked at the group. "We've got elderly people down there," Walter continued. "Children." His eyes moved toward the cottage. "We saw your roof." Charlotte frowned. "The snow's thinner over it," Walter explained, "melting from underneath." He swallowed. "We knew." His voice cracked. "We knew you had heat." Then Walter looked at Charlotte in a way no one in Cedar Hollow ever had before. Not as Nathan's widow. Not as the foolish pregnant woman who bought a ruin. As their last hope. "Can we come in?" Charlotte's eyes moved to Ryan. He could not meet her gaze. And suddenly she was back on that porch. Nathan's farmhouse behind him. $500 in her hand. His voice. "You can't raise 2 children out here alone." She remembered Caleb asking where they would sleep. She remembered walking while pregnant because there was nowhere else to go. She remembered kneeling in the dirt outside this cottage and wondering whether her children would freeze because of the choice she had made. Now Ryan stood outside her door, freezing, homeless for the night, dependent on her mercy. Charlotte could have closed the door. No one would have blamed her. Instead, she noticed the little girl trembling beside Walter. Charlotte stepped back. "There is room." Those 3 words changed everything. One by one, they entered. The moment the townspeople felt the mild air inside, they stopped. No fire roared in the hearth. No generator hummed. Yet warmth surrounded them. Charlotte gave them blankets. She heated water. She divided the food. There wasn't enough for generosity. So she made generosity out of what they had. Ryan sat silently against the wall. After a while, his old instincts returned. "We should organize supplies," he said weakly. "Someone needs to take charge. I can—" "Enough." Walter's voice filled the room. Everyone turned. The old farmer stared at Ryan. "You don't take charge here." Ryan's face tightened. Walter pointed toward Charlotte. "This woman kept her boy alive while carrying another child inside her. She rebuilt this place with her own hands while we laughed at her." "Silence. You're sitting in her house?" Walter's voice softened. "And you're alive because she opened her door." Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time since Charlotte had known him, he had nothing to say. Over the next 2 days, the cottage became something Charlotte had never imagined. A shelter. Walter and several men fashioned a sled and returned to town. They brought back an elderly couple, then a mother with 2 children, then another family. Soon the single room was crowded with bodies, blankets, wet boots, and whispered prayers. Charlotte organized the food. She showed people how to conserve water. She assigned places for children to sleep closest to the warmest sections of the floor. Nobody questioned her. Nobody pitied her. They listened. Because Charlotte Bennett was no longer the woman Cedar Hollow had watched walk away with one suitcase. She was the woman keeping them alive. Late one night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Charlotte sat near the wall. Her back ached. Her swollen feet throbbed. She was exhausted beyond words. Caleb came quietly and sat beside her. "Mom." "Yeah." He looked around at the sleeping townspeople. "Are they all staying because of our house?" Charlotte nodded. Caleb thought about that. Then he placed his hand on her belly. "No," he whispered. Charlotte looked at him. "They're staying because of you." Her eyes filled instantly. Charlotte pulled him against her. For months, she had believed survival meant finding a place where no one could throw her children out. Now she understood something larger. A home was not defined by whose name appeared on a deed. It was not the walls you inherited. It was not the land someone could take away. A home was the place where, when someone stood freezing outside your door, you chose to make room. Charlotte looked across the crowded cottage. At Walter, at frightened children sleeping safely. And finally, at Ryan wrapped in one of her blankets. Then she felt her daughter move beneath her heart. Charlotte placed her palm over the tiny kick. The woman who had arrived on Raven's Crest believed she had been abandoned by the world. But now, the world had come knocking on her door, and she had opened it. Not because they deserved her forgiveness, but because she had discovered something Ryan never understood. Real strength was not having the power to leave someone outside. It was having every reason to close the door, and choosing to open it anyway. Wutterwortefart Part 7. Inspirational Conclusion. The place she chose to call home. By the time the roads to Cedar Hollow were finally cleared, the storm had already changed the town forever. But perhaps no one had changed more than Charlotte Bennett. The woman who had climbed Raven's Crest with one suitcase, an 8-year-old boy, and a baby growing beneath her heart was no longer someone people whispered about with pity. Now, when they spoke her name, they spoke it with respect. Word of the stone cottage spread quickly. First through Cedar Hollow, then beyond it. People wanted to understand how an abandoned house with no furnace and no generator had remained warm enough to shelter an entire group of people during one of the worst freezes the region had seen in decades. Within weeks, engineers and architects arrived from the state capital. Charlotte watched them walk around the cottage carrying expensive instruments and notebooks. At first, some were skeptical. Then she showed them Elias Whitmore's journal. She led them to the northern intake. She explained the underground channels. She showed them the repaired stone joints and the sealed chamber beneath the hearth. They measured temperatures. They studied airflow. They crawled beneath the floor. And slowly, their skepticism disappeared. One engineer stood in the center of the cottage for a long time before finally saying, "This shouldn't have been forgotten." Charlotte looked at Elias's old journal. "No," she replied softly. "It shouldn't have. The system wasn't magic. It was something far more beautiful. It was knowledge. Simple principles of earth, stone, airflow, and heat working together exactly as Elias had understood them more than a century earlier. And Charlotte had brought them back to life. Soon, Cedar Hollow began raising money to preserve the cottage and study the design. Families volunteered. Local builders came to learn. Plans were created to incorporate parts of Elias's passive heating principles into new homes and to improve older ones. The place people had once called Widow's Ridge received another name, Hearthstone House. Charlotte cried when she saw the wooden sign, not because her cottage had become important, but because for the first time, something that had been associated with abandonment had been given a name that meant warmth. Ryan left Cedar Hollow before spring. He never publicly apologized. Some wounds do not receive the apology they deserve. But before leaving, he came to Hearthstone House one final time. Charlotte found him standing outside alone. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ryan held out a folder. Inside were documents concerning Nathan's old farm. "I'm selling it," he said. Charlotte looked at him. Ryan lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." 3 words. That was all. There was a time when Charlotte would have given anything to hear them. Now she realized she no longer needed them. She didn't forgive him because what he had done was acceptable. She forgave him because she refused to carry his cruelty into the life she was building. Months later, with help from the community and a modest loan, Charlotte bought the old farm back. Caleb was standing beside her when she received the deed. "Are we going home?" he asked. Charlotte looked across the fields where she had once believed her entire life belonged. Then she smiled. "No." Caleb seemed surprised. Charlotte knelt carefully beside him. "We're already home." She kept the farm, but she didn't move back. Instead, Charlotte turned it into a community learning center dedicated to sustainable building, practical skills, and helping families become more self-sufficient. Elias Whitmore's journal was placed inside a glass case near the entrance. Above it hung a simple plaque. Knowledge has little value when it is hidden. Its greatest purpose is to keep someone else from being left in the cold. Spring eventually reached Raven's Crest. The snow melted. Wildflowers appeared between stones Charlotte once believed could grow nothing. And on a quiet May morning, several weeks earlier than expected, Charlotte gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Hope. When the nurse placed the tiny child against Charlotte's chest, Caleb stood beside the bed with tears running openly down his face. "Hi, Hope," he whispered. "I'm your big brother." Charlotte began to cry. She looked at her daughter, then at her son. For one aching moment, she wished Nathan could see them. And somehow, in Caleb's gentle hand, resting on his sister's head, she felt that a part of him could. That summer, Charlotte sat outside Hearthstone House while Caleb chased fireflies across the ridge. Baby Hope slept against her chest beneath the little blanket Walter's wife had knitted months earlier. The wind moved softly through the grass. Once, that sound had terrified Charlotte. It had sounded like something trying to break into the house. Now it sounded different, almost like breathing. Charlotte looked at the stone walls behind her. She remembered arriving there with $50 left. She remembered Caleb crying for his father. She remembered wondering whether she had made the worst mistake of her life. She had thought the cottage was where life had sent her after taking everything else away. She had been wrong. It was where she discovered what could never be taken from her. Courage, compassion, knowledge, and the strength to begin again? Charlotte kissed Hope's forehead. Caleb's laughter drifted across the ridge, and she finally understood that sometimes life does not return what it takes from us. Sometimes it gives us something new. Not the life we planned, not the home we lost, but another road, another purpose, another reason to wake up tomorrow. Charlotte had arrived on Raven's Crest believing she had been left with nothing. In the end, she discovered that nothing was where she had been forced to begin. It was never where she was meant to stay. And the woman who had once stood outside a locked door with nowhere to go had built a home whose door would never be closed to someone in need. Charlotte's story reminds us of something life has a painful way of teaching. Sometimes the door that closes behind us is not the end of our story. Sometimes it is the beginning of the part we were never brave enough to imagine. Charlotte lost her husband. She lost her home. She lost her security. And while carrying an unborn child beneath her heart, she was forced to walk into an uncertain future with an 8-year-old boy holding her hand. She had every reason to give up, but courage did not come to Charlotte as fearlessness. It came quietly. It looked like getting out of bed when her body hurt. It looked like repairing one more stone when her hands were bleeding. It looked like telling Caleb, "We're going to be okay." Even while she was still learning to believe those words herself. And eventually, courage looked like opening her door to the very people who had once turned their backs on her. That may be the greatest lesson of all. Real strength is not becoming hard because life has hurt you. Real strength is going through the fire and still choosing kindness. So if you are listening to this while facing a season of loss, loneliness, or uncertainty, remember Charlotte standing on that cold porch with almost nothing left. Your life may not look the way you once planned. You may have lost people you thought would always be beside you. You may even feel as though you're starting over too late. But as long as you can take one more step, your story is still being written. Sometimes the place that looks like the end of the road becomes the very place where you discover who you were meant to become. If Charlotte's story touched your heart, share in the comments. What is one difficult season in your life that made you stronger than you ever thought you could be? Your story may be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe that kindness is stronger than bitterness, that hope can survive even the coldest seasons, and that it is never too late to begin again. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Because sometimes, all it takes to keep someone going is knowing that somewhere in this world, there is still a door open for them.